Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientists monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for the webinar. Today, Dr. Carrie McAdams will present The Social Brain and Anorexia Nervosa. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation is committed to alleviating the suffering caused by mental illness by awarding grants that will lead to advances and breakthroughs in scientific research. The Foundation is the largest private funder of mental health research grants. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $380 million to fund more than 5,500 grants to more than 4,500 scientists around the world. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists who are working to find breakthroughs in disorders such as addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, and schizophrenia. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Carrie McAdams. Dr. McAdams is Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. She was also a 2012 Foundation Young Investigator grantee. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. McAdams' presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the presentation. Following the presentation, I'll present your questions to Dr. McAdams, and we'll address as many of them as possible in the time allotted. Now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. McAdams. Carrie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I am really delighted to be able to share my work and have appreciated the support from the Brain and Behavior Foundation and really for just being able to do mental health research, which is my true passion and what I love. So I want to start by talking about sort of our intuitive understanding of the world and how that can be disruptive and how we need to think about the world a little bit differently. So this is just a schematic through the middle of a brain, just an artist illustration. And then I've imposed on it the words perception, reasoning, and behaviors. And generally, we go through the world thinking about life in this A to B to C. We see something, we see people in the room, we recognize them. That's done sort of unconsciously. We don't actually have to parse to tell the difference between a person and a TV. All of that happens automatically. We then use what we see in the world, what we hear. You're hearing my voice, you're seeing the screen. We use that to reason about what we want to do next. Who do we want to talk to? Where do we want to go? What do we want to do? And then we act on behaviors. And this system serves all of us pretty well and gets us through the day. In mental illness, what we've learned about how the brain works is that the system is a lot more complicated. What we perceive may depend on how we behave, who we choose to talk to, where we want to go, and the interactions that we have can change what we choose to think about, what we reason about. And this question of how our perception translates into our experience of the world and then our behaviors is the question that I was most interested in really studying, and the reason I became a psychiatrist when it became possible because of technological advances to really look inside human brains and start thinking about illness. So this is kind of the construct that I want people to be thinking about today as I present the data that we've been collecting from women with and recovered from anorexia nervosa. So the outline of my talk is I'm going to introduce the disease, anorexia nervosa, that I've been studying for about the last 10 years. Then we're going to talk about social perception, and we're going to talk about brain-based factors, the neural factors, as well as cognitive factors. And those are the processes that we're thinking about. And then I want to talk about where we think this work can go and how that might benefit the people that have this disease. So first of all, I chose to study anorexia nervosa in adults. The diagnostic criteria for this illness are a little unusual as psychiatric illnesses go, because one of them is that the patients, the people that suffer from this illness, have to have a low body weight for their life. So if they have to have lost a lot of body weight such that they could be in a malnourished state. So it's a very physiological. As a scientist, it's objective. It gives us an objective. There is weight loss. There is a low body weight involved in this illness. And then that's coupled with the kinds of things that are more common in psychiatry. Fears about gaining weight, obsessions about what one weighs. And then you have to have one of the following: a disturbed perception of your body. So a belief that your body doesn't match with what the reality is. Or your self-esteem has to be very related to your image, such that, if you feel like you look bad, you can't leave the house, you don't want to talk to anyone, this tight tying of I'm only a good person if I look a certain way, or a denial that weight is too low. So we often will see patients that maybe don't think their weight is too low, say someone that does marathons and has felt like, oh, I'm the right weight to be someone for a marathon, even though they have developed stress fractures and infertility, because it's not actually physiologically healthy to be at that low body weight. So a persistent denial that the weight is too low. So these are the criteria that we use to decide if someone has the illness or not. Approximately 1% of women, if you look at sign of 18 to 40 years old, will have this illness. So this is the same incidence as schizophrenia. It's about 5 times more common in women, and it actually has had the highest mortality, of any psychiatric illness for most of as long as we've been measuring these things. It recently, opiate deaths surpassed the mortality rate. But this is a really high mortality rate, and it's largely because the medical complications from being malnourished are very severe. That's the definition of being malnourished. People die from this illness. Now, the other major problem that we have, the biggest problem in anorexia nervosa, is that people really do die, and it's very difficult to treat. So 50 to 70% of adults that are treated for anorexia that seek treatment will go on to relapse or have a chronic course of the disease. And even when people do recover, it takes many, many years. So there are people that recover, but this is not an illness that comes on in 5 minutes and goes away. It takes a long time to lose the weight, and it takes a long time to attain recovery. And most of the research has suggested that regaining the weight is not sufficient for recovery, and it's not protective for relapse and chronicity. You have to do more than just change the weight. So how does treatment of this illness lead to recovery? So obviously, the person who develops the disease has been having insufficient calorie intake to maintain a healthy body weight, so they have to eat more. And meal support, coaching patients through meals, directing what they should eat, works in the short term. So in a short-term setting, if the food is presented in a supportive environment, people do gain weight. It's a very rare patient that does not respond in terms of the weight gain, but more than half of patients relapse. And these treatment programs for eating disorders really change the eating disorder behaviors. So they might stop someone from engaging in overexercise. They might, allow someone to eat a sufficient quantity of food at a single meal, but they don't really always fix in the short term the thoughts that I should weigh less, I don't need to eat, the thoughts, the exercise, the beliefs, and that take a longer time to change. And so in the short term, we can kind of quickly nutritionally rehabilitate patients, but then the patients might leave the treatment center, or they might complete their outpatient intensive therapy programs and things like that. And we see a lot of relapse in that. When I started working in this field 10 years ago, I was really interested in this question of sustained recovery. What enables people to be recovered? When you talk to patients that have recovered from the illness, What do they report? What is different about them? And 3 factors had really stood out in the literature. They reported having better relationships with other people, so they had better friends, more supportive partners, changes with siblings, parents, whoever is in their life. They had improved how they interacted with them. They felt like they had higher self-esteem, so feeling better about themselves, their ability to accomplish and succeed. And they had improved self-knowledge, so a better idea of, it's stressful for me to be in this situation, but not this situation. So they had developed this ability to recognize stressors in their life and what they enjoyed. So when I looked at this 10 years ago, I decided that the area that I wanted to study was social brain function, a focus on social cognition, social reasoning. How does the brain work in the patients that have the illness and that have recovered from the illness, and is that different from healthy controls? Now, the model that I think is most helpful to think about mental illness in general is a very old model, the Biopsychosocial model. And with that model, we think that mental illness really emerges because of combinations of what are biological factors such as genetics, neural circuits, hormones, physiological kind of responses. Then in addition, there are psychological factors, and I like to think of psychology as kind of the dynamics, the thoughts that are actually in our head at any given moment. So those are the preoccupations about eating, thoughts about body image. And then there's the social world or our environment, which in eating disorders, it's been shown that sort of if you're in an environment that no one diets, if you don't have any stress, the illness just doesn't emerge. So we really need to be able to look at all of these things together. And before I became a psychiatrist, I was a neuroscientist, and I was interested in quantitating how brain function changed. I was using animal models at that time. But the invention of functional MRI really allows us to look inside the brain of people and to ask questions about biology, psychology, and environment all at the same time. The way a magnetic resonance imaging machine works is it is looking at the blood oxygen level dependent signal, which is what BOLD stands for, and that's basically looking at how much oxygen is present in hemoglobin in different parts of our brain. And so people lie on this table, they look at a video screen, it slides inside the machine, and then a very large magnetic field is placed on the brain, and that fluctuates water molecules. And we look at how the water molecules move in our blood depends on how much oxygen and deoxygenated hemoglobin is happening. So that is connected with thoughts that the patients have because we're looking at this magnetic fluctuations while the patients are essentially playing little video games. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today, is what we've learned about the brains in people with eating disorders based on using this technology that links up the biological, the psychological, and then I chose to look at social relationships. So we've had the patients doing tasks that involve thinking about themselves or thinking about other people. I'm going to start with talking about this project. This was a National Institute of Mental Health Career Development Award that was looking at that question, the neurobiology of social thinking and anorexia. We had a cross-sectional design where we used social cognitive MRI tasks as well as office assessments measuring clinical and cognitive aspects. And then we had 3 groups of women that we recruited. They were women that had recently had anorexia, women that had had anorexia nervosa in their lifetime but were now in weight recovery, and healthy controls. And we had 3 aims for this study. We wanted to look at whether the brain was different in these social and self-perception tasks based on having had anorexia. We wanted to see if we could find anything in the social brain that depended on illness state. So we were really interested in identifying differences in currently ill and weight recovered patients. And we wanted to look at whether anything we could measure in the office helped us understand the brain or the illness state. So this was an ambitious first study. And one of the biggest questions that has been a challenge for anyone wanting to do research in eating disorders is defining illness and recovery. A person doesn't, become malnourished overnight. It takes months of inadequate food intake. And similarly, a person doesn't recover from an eating disorder in a month after they've gained some weight. So we chose to look at people that had met criteria for anorexia in the last few months, but were stable or recently refed. I wanted to minimize effects of acute starvation on the brain, but to really understand neural differences during the illness and in this period when there's a very high risk of relapse. Because to really help people with this disease, we need to find ways to reduce the risk of relapsing. And then I took very weight-recovered women. These are people who had had the illness at some point in their life, but had been at a healthy BMI for at least 2 years and were not currently actively bulimic or having another eating disorder. And the goal here was to look for neural differences important in recovery, and particularly focusing on the weight recovery, because so much of the mortality from this illness is related to the malnutrition and the underweight periods in the disease. And then we also wanted to look at to see if we could find neural traits, so biological factors that might be related to the development of the illness. And some of research had suggested that if you were at a healthy weight for 2 years, there was a low risk of relapsing. So these were the groups. And I think it's really important anytime you are working in this illness to really understand where the patient is in the process of recovery, because it is a slow process. So when we compared these groups in our office, they were not different in age. They were not differences in their intelligence quotient. The body mass index was lower for the ones that had the illness, which is, of course, expected. On our eating assessments, all three groups were different, with the ones that were currently underweight, most severely reporting symptoms, and then the weight recovered, and then the healthy controls. And importantly, these two groups were not different on either depression or anxiety. So those may be some of the traits that predispose people to developing the illness, is that there's a level of dissatisfaction, emotional dissatisfaction, that falls into related disorders, but not explicitly the eating disorder. But that didn't differ for these two groups at all. Okay, so now we're going to move into the tasks that we used in the brain to look at what is actually happening when these patients are sick. And I decided to start with the simplest task that we used, which simply involved looking at pictures of either yourself or a stranger that was kind of matched in age and coloring. All of the headshots were kind of shoulders to head, different head angles. They always had both eyes. There were neutral or positive expressions. And basically, one picture would pop up every 10 to 30 seconds and stay up for 4 seconds. And it was a passive viewing task. So we didn't ask the subjects to do anything other than just look at the images. And this was kind of our baseline task, because this illness is so tied to body image and body perceptions that we were really interested in that question of, are there differences in visual perception? Does it different when it's a picture of you versus a picture of someone else? And the data that we found, and so I'm going to present a lot of pictures of brain data. This data is these clusters here are statistically pulled out of the data based on the fact that the activations within these regions were different in our three groups in a whole brain ANOVA. And we were comparing the difference between the activation in the brain when you saw pictures of yourself versus when you saw pictures of the stranger. This is a bar graph where I've extracted the data. On the top, it's from the left cluster, the cluster on the left side of the brain. On the bottom, it's extracting the data from the right side. And so this is the statistics, the whole brain comparison that says these areas of the brain are different for the patient population. So the currently ill patient is different from the weight recovered in the healthy control. To get a little more information out of it, we can say, how is it different? And here what we've done is we've pulled out the actual beta values, the parameters of how much oxygenation, deoxygenation was happening in these clusters. And what you can see is that the currently ill patients had more activity in these two regions, which are both bilateral fusiform. This is a visual cortex area involved in face perception, and we're showing faces. So this is kind of a straightforward study. They're looking at pictures of faces. People that have recently had anorexia have more activity in this part of the brain when they look at a picture of themselves, but the weight recovered and the healthy controls are not different from each other, although both are different from the currently ill patient. So now to interpret this kind of data, what does this mean? If we go back to our perception, our reasoning, our behavior model, we have increased fusiform activation for self-images relative to stranger images for our recently ill patients. And so what we're seeing here is that the patient with anorexia are having kind of an increased visual response when they see themselves. And now this other stuff that I filled in here, this is a conceptualization. This is not a definitive, I haven't done the A to B to this or connecting different areas. That's some of the technology that's been developed even more recently. And that's the kind of work that we're hoping to do in the future, where we can put together how the unconscious sort of perceptual response. So unconsciously, the visual cortex is saying, I see a picture of me, I'm very excited about it. That might lead to the patient thinking about what they look like more than our healthy controls and our recovered patients, and that might then lead to actions to change what I look like, right? So this is all hypothetical, but it makes sense. These results are very consistent with how the disease is defined. The disease is defined by problems with visual perception related to our self-image. We see the patients with the illness see themselves differently, and then that might lead to the behaviors that are the eating disorder type behaviors in the illness. Now, this is not that exciting to me as a scientist, because this is sort of a chicken or egg problem. We know the illness includes this problem. Now we find the brain representation of it we expect it as. The real power, in my opinion, for functional MRI is allowing us to look at things that we don't know about the illness, which might enable us to design new treatments for the illness. And so the second imaging task that I selected is the multi-round trust game. Now, this game was developed and adapted for MRI scanners by my longtime collaborator, Dr. Reed Montague. This game involves two people playing a game in a scanner. One is an investor and the other is the trustee. Now, in the case of my study, everybody that we put in the scanner was a trustee. And they played with a computer simulation of an investor, but they were told they were playing with another person that was just on a computer in the building. The investor person gets $20, and they decide how much they want to keep and how much they want to invest in their stock market broker, mutual fund advisor. What they decide to invest is given to the trustee 3 times that. So if they gave all $20, this person would get $60. Then our patient, our subject in the study, would decide how much they want to keep and how much they want to repay. And the beauty of this task is that it really, over time, we have them do 10 rounds of this game. And so we're looking at how a person evaluates whether a relationship is good or bad and how it's changing. And so in the course of the game, the total amount the investor gets is what they keep plus what is repaid. The total amount the trustee gets is what they keep. But the key here in psychiatry is that interpersonal relationships and whether the people we interact with are trustworthy or not trustworthy is really important in our ability to move through the world. And so this is a way to sort of take this process of developing a relationship You're going to play with the same person for 10 rounds. You want to make as much money as possible. Those are the instructions people get. And then we look at their brain function while they create this new relationship. And so those numbers, the amount that is given to, that the trustee gives back, the amount that the investor gives, allows us to do objective measurement of changes in the relationship. And this game has been extensively examined in mathematical processing, computational, to really understand which are the keys to what predicts whether a relationship is getting better or worse. Now, when we looked at the data, there's a lot of different pieces of this task when people play this game, but this is sort of what it looks like to the person in the scanner. They get a screen that says, this round, the person you're playing with gave $14 and kept $6 for themselves. So the investor here would have $6 here, and then they gave $14 to the trustee. What Dr. Montague and his colleagues had found was that the key to these relationships and whether they're getting better or worse really was mathematically based on the relative change based on what was happening on the current rounds, which are shown at the end, compared to the previous rounds. So is the relationship that you have with this other person getting better for you, or is it getting worse? So just kind of to quickly kind of skip through this, when you see the screen, if the screen on the prior round had the person had given you all 20, then that would be likely a sign that the relationship was getting worse. And it has to do both with your behavior. Were you nicer to the other person when they were meaner to you, or were they nicer to you when you were meaner to them? And so we compute this mathematically so that every round of the game after the first rounds is coded into whether when you see the screen, it indicates the relationship is getting better or it's getting worse. And then we look at how the brain activity differs when the relationship is getting better for you versus when your brain activity when the relationship is getting worse. So we did this, the patients with the anorexia, all three groups, played this game. And what we found were that two regions in the social cognitive network, the precuneus and the right temporoparietal juncture, had much less activity when the other person was nicer for both of our patient groups. So there was less activity here than for the healthy controls. And there was one region, again, it was the fusiform, that had less activity for the patients that were currently with disease compared to the other two groups. So what does this tell us about this illness, this data here? What does this tell us about how people with anorexia nervosa interact with other people? How is social behavior different during the illness and in recovery? And what we're essentially seeing is that there's this reduced social brain responses for kindness. So this is, again, an interpretation. We see areas of the brain involved in social processing have less ability to notice positive gestures. And these are positive gestures based on this mathematical neuroeconomic game. But we can then think about the clinical patients that I see with the disease. And you see them feeling like other people don't like me, nobody wants me around, and there's a tendency in the illness to isolate socially, to avoid other people. And if we think about the world, if you think about perhaps you've been in a meeting and someone was supportive about your ideas, but you didn't notice that, and then you leave the meeting and someone might say, you know, Mark was really interested in your ideas, and then you change how you behave with them. And so this reduced social brain responses for kindness, you know, if you don't think other people are supportive of you, if you don't notice when they are supportive, then it can really set up a cascade. And this is the kind of process that might reinforce eating disorder behaviors, cause patients to relapse, to isolate, to avoid. And awareness of this problem might be something that could be targeted in treatments or in the outcome process. In addition, it may be possible to train people to learn to use these areas of the brain, potentially with new MRI techniques such as real-time fMRI, things like that. You might be able to train people to start to use these areas when they're interacting. Okay, so the third imaging task that I want to talk to is based on verbal appraisal tasks. And essentially, we have the patient in the scanner reading statements that are either directed about themselves, about a friend of theirs, or about what their friend thinks about them. And when they read the statement, they hit a button that says, I agree with this statement or I disagree with this statement. And again, the most important thing in imaging is that we look at the difference in different conditions because the brain is always active. All the areas are always receiving blood flow, taking oxygen out. It's the difference in which areas of the brain are being utilized that really tells us how the illnesses perpetuate, what is the use of the brain. And that was really the technology that just didn't exist before the invention of the functional MRI. So I'm only going to be talking about two of the cognitive processes just to save time, and I really want to talk about self-relevance. So in this case, we're just looking at the statements about ourselves, and we're going to compare the brain activity that happens when we agree with statements about ourselves versus when we disagree with statements about ourselves. We tried to find words that cause people to think. So there are some words that everybody agrees with and they don't even really have to think about. Like it's almost like you have to think you're nice or you can't survive. So we selected words that people, like moody is a word that people might agree with even though it's a little bit of a negative word. But some people do feel like they have mood strings. Interesting, independent, words that people are not always they have to think for a little bit. Am I really an independent person? And that's really what we were trying to capture, were words that people have to think about whether it fits their picture of themselves or whether they disagree. Now, on this format, this is a transparent brain representation. This is all the same cluster. This is shown with the brain slices on top of it. And again, this is the statistical significance difference. And this is these three groups were compared to see, is there a region of the brain that is different for this contrast of agreeing about ourselves versus disagreeing about ourselves. And so what we find here is that the healthy people, and other people have shown this type of data as well, healthy people tend to use the front of their brain, this medial prefrontal cortex extending into the cingulate, when they agree with words about ourselves. And this area is considered part of the brain that's involved in giving us a secure sense of who we are. Now, this is really the most interesting data that I've collected because it was a surprise to me that both the people that were currently ill as well as the people that were weight recovered actually use this area more when they disagree with words about themselves. If we were simplistic and we thought, people that are no longer currently ill will look the same as healthy controls, we would expect this pink bar to go up like the healthy control. But what we're actually seeing here is that this is a trait that appears to be persistent in adults with this illness. So even when you've recovered from the eating disorder behaviors and the problems that potentially led to the illness, with the weight loss, even the visual stuff goes away, there remains this difference in how the brain is being used when we think about ourselves. So what does that give us? This is this perception that our patients with the illness may have a consistent difference in how they think about themselves. So when questions are asked, how do you feel about this, or what do you want, that question may be being answered by different circuitry in the brain. Again, this is all an interpretation. We don't really know what happens. These are things that we do see in patients with the illness. We see that there's a lot of struggle to figure out what they really want to do. This could extend from who they want to marry, whether they want to get married, whether they want which kind of career they want. Decision making is often very difficult with these big life choices, and we can think about how if we don't know exactly what makes us happy or who we are, it's harder to make big decisions. One of the behaviors that's very common in eating disorders is that there's a preference for very objective activities. So things like counting the number of calories, counting how many minutes did I run. There's a preference behaviorally for things that are very quantitative and easy to say, I did it, I didn't do it, completing a puzzle. And so this may all be related to having trouble with feeling secure about how one thinks about oneself. Very hypothetical. We're trying to find more. We're currently doing new studies that will be trying to tie in reward pathways into self-perception, reasoning, and these behaviors that actually we see in people both in the illness and after recovery. Now, the real passion that I have for this illness has to do with recovery. And so far, we haven't found much that tells us how the patients that recover are really different from the patients that are sick. And in this additional contrast in the social identity task, we do something called social self-evaluation. So this ability to take ourselves out of our own perspective and think about someone else's perspective. So Mary believes I'm reckless, but what if Mary is someone that never does anything, that never leaves the house if they don't know exactly who's going to go there, versus one's own perspective. We typically engage more social other regions, and this is observed in all the groups. So our subjects with anorexia nervosa, recovered, they all use the brain more. They use the typical regions that are used more when we ask these questions. But in addition to that, we found this really exciting finding where the people that were weight recovered from the illness differed from both of the other groups when we looked at this perspective taking contrast compared to direct. And so this is again the transparent brain. There were 3 clusters here: bilateral inferior frontal gyri and the dorsal anterior cingulate. And in all of these clusters, the weight recovered patients are using these areas more when they're answering the direct questions, whereas our healthy control subjects engage these areas more when they're asked to take that friend's perspective. Mary believes I am something. And interestingly, the currently ill patients don't really look that different in all 3 cases. So what does this tell us about the disease? So importantly, all of these regions are in the salience network, and they suggest that there may be a neural compensation. The weight recovered subjects differ from both of the other groups. So they're using their brain differently to think about themselves, potentially because of that problem that we saw earlier, where the medial prefrontal cortex is not active for agreement, only for disagreement. Now, in order to truly relate neural activations to this process of recovery compared to illness, this was a cross-sectional study. And so we don't know if recovery is causally related to these changes. Like if we could train the brain to do this, would people then recover from the illness? We can't do that without much more complicated studies. It could also be that this difference is related to a predictor, such that the currently ill group is split into both of these groups, and some of them will recover and some of them won't. Or it could be that this is a trait that is associated with the disease biologically, but it becomes suppressed during the acute illness, so that we can't see this during the illness. So we really would like to be able to get funding to do within subject longitudinal studies where we can track how the brain changes over the process over the course of illness. As people move from illness to recovery, do we see this change happening? Now, I have talked about lots of things today, and I want to kind of present this summary slide here to kind of tie them together. So in a clinical condition, we have sort of trait, state, and recovery. So a trait effect would be something that is different in the healthy controls compared to the other 2 groups. A state effect is present only in the currently ill group, but not in the other two groups. And a recovery effect would be something present in the weight recovered. And we want to tie this into the cognitive process. So we're seeing that perception of kindness and that self-relevance problems, that when people are asked to do that, we're finding differences in 3 neural regions, all of which fall into a neural network called the default mode network. When we look at the state effects, we saw differences related to perception of negative behavior and the physical body, the face image perception. We got fusiform, and that area is part of the visual attention network. When we think about the recovery process, we see these differences related to perspective taking and direct self-evaluations. So these social self-evaluations differences and the regions that we found are all part of the salience network. So this starts to give us an understanding of how the brain needs to change, how the brain differs in illness, and how the brain differs during the recovery process. Okay, so very quickly, I want to kind of talk about, excuse me for a second. I want to talk about what we measure in the office. So this is a statement here, and we want to know what your immediate first response is to the sentence. So if you see that sentence, what do you think the answer is? People pick different things. They fill in the blank with questions about, it's about myself, it's about my friend, or it's about the situation. And these immediate biases start to give us information about how the circuits in our brain may be wired, how we go through the world. When an event happens, what do we do? And so this question is pulled from the internal, personal, situational attributions questionnaire, which is really looking at how our perception of social activities varies depending on negative and positive events. And so if you get a positive event, that immediate first thought of what does this mean? Again, it could be about us, it could be about our friends, or it could be about the situation. When we did this study, we measured a lot of things in our patients, and we were looking at 4 things that were related to interpersonal and social behavior. And this was really the only measure that we obtained that was related to recovery. So our patients that were currently ill had a negative externalizing bias, which basically means they tended to blame themselves for all of the bad things. Our weight recovered patients did not do this. Our healthy controls did not do this. So this was really exciting data because it gave us something we could measure in the office that tracked with recovery and was related to social brain function, potentially, because it's this bias, it's this immediate effect of something happened, what was it? And the goal, in my opinion, in functional imaging research is to help us understand what we need to target when we're working with the patient. So this is nice because any clinician can assess this using a self-report questionnaire and can see where is the patient, how is the patient interacting with other people. In addition to that, in both depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, this tendency towards self-blame can be explicitly targeted in cognitive therapy. And so we can really try to change that in a person immediately. We were lucky enough to get a foundation award from the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health. It's a Texas organization to call up all the people that had done our studies, reassess their clinical status, and look at whether they had changes in this externalizing bias. And so we were able to find most of the people that had done our brain imaging studies, all of the people that had been recovered when we started stayed recovered, which is great. And 40% of the people that had been recently ill when we started had moved into weight recovery. So that's also, consistent with what we expect. And the interesting thing here was that the externalizing bias also changed over this time. So in AIM-2, we found these things where the recovery process included reduced self-blame as well as improved perspective taking. So we can kind of start to see that this process of change, what has to happen in order for people to move into recovery. And we see that neurally, we see these changes related to using the salient circuits when they think about themselves. That might lead to conscious, altered reasoning about oneself and other people, and that might promote more recovery behaviors. Recovery behaviors being, avoiding the eating disorders, not isolating, interacting with other people, developing self-esteem. So really the next steps here are to find ways that we can change self-evaluation and then assess the impact of changing self-evaluation on the brain and recovery and all of these targets. So I just want to kind of quickly conclude with the model that we're really working with now in thinking about this illness. And the model that we have is that in anorexia, there is some alterations in the brain circuitry that's involved in thinking about ourselves and other people. That may lead to a perception that is that something's wrong with me. I feel wrong, unlike other people. When people feel wrong, they might think if I changed what I looked like, that would change that feeling, which promotes eating disorder behaviors. And then it goes back to the circuit. And people could jump on here at any point. Most of the eating disorder treatments really target the behaviors and then the cognitions here. We don't have treatments that target the brain or the perceptions. And we now have targets related to these processes, related to social cognition and social perceptions, and also related to the neural targets related to the brain. So this enables us to think about really creating new treatment programs, new approaches to considering the illness, and importantly, focusing on the recovery process from the disease. Okay, so I want to thank, there's been a lot of people. I was kind of stunned at how many people have helped me, and I may have left some off. And of course, funding. I have gotten a NARSAD Young Investigator Award, which was involved in some of this work and additional work that I've done in adolescence. And I just really, it's very challenging to work in research today, and foundation support is really critical for allowing us to jump from one problem to the next problem and to really start to put it all together into something that can make sense. So I'm going to switch over. I'm going to stop there, and we can switch over to answer questions.
Great. Well, Carrie, thank you so much for really doing a great job presenting the research that leads to conclusions that have the potential to really change how treatment can help people. So thank you for the work you do and for an excellent presentation. I guess one question would be, does this approach lead to an ability to figure out who might be at greater risk of relapsing versus who might not for the illness, and therefore change some of the interventions?
Yeah, so I think that we do have ideas for what are targets. So when I've talked to clinicians in the field, I think we can recognize that some of the conversations we have with the patients are very, very, self-blame inducing. So people that have these low externalizing bias, everything that happens in the world is about themselves. And they can't tell who among their friends is actually a nice person, a difficult person, is actually supportive, like figuring out who is supportive for us. So I think that this work is starting to allow us to have a better sense of what needs to change. One of the problems has been that the eating disorder symptoms themselves have been largely what treatment has focused on. So if you only focus on the behaviors, and the behaviors change in the short term, such as weight. It doesn't, like I think I said earlier, just because you lose 10 pounds doesn't mean you have the illness, but if you gain 10 pounds, that also doesn't mean you're recovered. And so really this question of what needs to be treated and how long should we be considering someone at risk for relapse, I think that type of work is really important, that the people that have this illness, that had the severe anorexia, continue to have high levels of depression, high levels of anxiety. They could relapse into this illness if they have really difficult interpersonal stressors. And so management of this disease needs to be much more focused, that this is a disease that needs management related to potentially interpersonal stressors long term, and checking in with therapists. And it's not just about only the specific eating behaviors.
I think that's very important and will make a difference in people's lives in terms of potential of relapse. I'm wondering if there's anything in your data that could be helpful for prevention in the first place, primary prevention, by looking at certain characteristics that then may result in an approach to preventing the illness. And I see you're now up on the video, so
yes,
everybody gets to have the face with the voice. So I'm happy that you're on the video as well.
Okay. So in terms of prevention, I think, that's actually, so I wasn't able to fit it into this presentation. I wanted to, because we had done that task that involves the words, had been funded by the Brain and Behavior Foundation to look at adolescents with the illness. And the interesting thing was that the adolescents with the illness don't look as different from healthy adolescents. And so you can almost create this idea that when an adolescent develops the illness, like it's a normal process in our brain to have to figure out who we are, like how we think about ourselves. So that the adolescents with the illness that had high concerns about body shape and high levels of anxiety were the ones that didn't relapse, or were the ones that relapsed. I'm sorry, did I say that backwards? So if you had very high levels of body shape concerns when you were a teenager, recently treated for anorexia, or you had high levels of anxiety, then those brain areas were more related. The areas that we see in adults were working the way the adults that are ill work. And so I think that starts to get at this prevention, and it also helps us understand normal neurodevelopment and how that ties into the illness, because it's a challenge, because of the adult illness is very different in its course and its clinical outcomes than adolescence. And it may be that every adolescent is undergoing these differentiations of who they are compared to their peers, but at some point you're supposed to mature out of that. And that process of developing a mature brain may be disrupted if this illness persists, and then we end up with adults with the illness that have brains that never, missed a window. And so for prevention, I think the really important thing is that we need to be able to target the connectivity in the circuits in the brain for kids that are reporting these high levels of body shape concerns, high levels of anxiety, and then maybe move forward to really recognize that the food intake, because eating and malnourishment is really something that would interfere with development of the brain.
I want to ask you a little bit about co-occurring conditions with eating disorders, such as depression, anxiety. Could you bring that into the conversation a little bit for our audience?
Yes. So I think that the circuits I'm talking about, the self-other perception process, all of us have this. We all have social cognitive circuits. Some of us are more anxious about people. Some of us are more anxious about experiences. People have different things that are anxiety-provoking and different sort of thresholds for when do you feel sad, when do you feel like the depression kind of starts and hits in. So it's very rare to encounter someone with an eating disorder that doesn't have anxiety and depression, particularly in adults. We're just going to talk about adults here. Most commonly, when they don't report those symptoms, I think it's partly because they don't actually know that it is anxiety. The anxiety may be perceived as gastrointestinal distress. My stomach hurts rather than I'm nervous. And learning to, and this is where the improved self-knowledge in treating the illness is very helpful. So when you're able to sort of understand anxiety makes it hard for me to eat, that takes us a step further into understanding what we need to do to recover from the illness. So I rarely see patients with eating disorders that do not have anxiety or depression as well. Generally, the eating disorder goes away. So a lot of the weight recovered patients with anorexia they were continue to be in contact with clinical providers that are giving them therapy for anxiety or medication for depression, things like that. And so I think recognition that risk of sort of moving into mental illness, moving into other illnesses, having the insight to know, and the eating disorder behaviors are really socially acceptable. Things like over-exercising and dieting are kind of socially acceptable ways to sort of numb the body and reduce emotional drives. And so that there's a kind of vicious cycle that can happen whereby during starvation, people don't feel as sad. And the refeeding process, when somebody is malnourished and then we start giving them food, the refeeding process of this illness, generally people get very angry and upset because when you're starving, you don't feel sad. You just feel numb. You're fatigued and tired. And so in some ways, sometimes we see this, you start treating the patient for the eating disorder, the eating symptoms, and then untreated anxiety and depression come out. So it's a very complicated illness here because the physiological effects of changing food intake are dramatic and powerful.
I think that's an important point in terms of the initiation and ongoing treatment. I want to ask one more question in the time allotted. A few people have asked about this, which is that often, as you know, people with this condition really don't seek help. They minimize it. They don't realize it, that they have it. What can a family member do to try to engage their loved one in treatment when they're concerned about them?
That is definitely a really important topic. The most important thing, I think, is to not give up on the patient. I think it's really important to empathize that it is very hard. I think until you've really worked with the patients, you don't recognize how impossible a statement like just eat more really is. This is a very difficult process. I work with a internal medicine physician, and we try to use the words nutritional rehabilitation more than you need psychiatric treatment, because nutritional rehabilitation can make sense to someone that has impaired concentration and fatigue, or osteoporosis or stress fractures. Getting a patient that's stuck in the illness to break out of it is a very long and slow process, and it has to begin with the food. And there's lots of different ways. There's tricks. There's words. There's food as medicine is something that I say to a lot of my patients, and that the starting point for recovery is simply committing to eating. Now, when patients don't know, there's an interesting thing that happens too, are people that claim they don't have an illness because they're choosing to not eat. You really can't tell the difference between someone that is sort of choosing to only do the same thing every single day and someone that can't learn to do something different. And when the brain is starving, I think learning becomes impaired. We have trouble with changing behaviors. So it's not so much that the person is choosing, it's actually that the brain is unable to make a different decision. And when people are in this state, it really takes a lot of effort to get the patient to tolerate the discomfort. And a lot of the responses, if you don't eat, like if you think about yourself, if you've had food poisoning, you don't go from food poisoning to suddenly eating everything you were eating before you had food poisoning. It's a gradual process of recovery. Eating disorders are like that. The GI tract really changes very quickly in response to what it's doing, and so there's a whole list. So just because the person may have an eating disorder doesn't mean the pain that they experience when they eat is psychological. The GI tract slows down. They will feel excessively full. These are real medical consequences of the disordered eating behaviors, and they don't go away. It's not talking to a psychiatrist or psychologist in an outpatient office that's going to help fix the gastrointestinal tract. It's the process of eating that has to come first. So validating that the medical symptoms, the problems with the gut and all of that are real is extremely helpful in getting the patients. A lot of times I feel like family members or patients, the eating disorder treatment programs will focus on things like, learn how to love yourself, learn how to do this. But in a lot of cases, we really just need the person to be able to eat enough and not have purging behaviors to start to begin to do therapy.
I think that you make a very important point for eating disorders and in a broader sense for other psychiatric conditions, that the person doesn't decide to have an illness, just as people don't decide to have cancer or other illnesses.
Exactly.
And it's so it's not a decision. They have this illness, and then it's incumbent upon professionals to help in the treatment, and certainly family members to be supportive and helpful as well. As difficult as that could be for any type of illness, to see a loved one suffering, then it's important for us to always be sensitive to that. Carrie, I want to again thank you for the work that you're doing on this important condition and for your presentation today. I also want to thank everybody in our audience who have joined us. All of the research we fund is made possible through private donations, so please consider making a contribution by visiting our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share it with a family member or friend, visit the Events and Webinars page on our website. I hope you'll join us again next month when Dr. Will Carpenter, Professor of Psychiatry and Pharmacology at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, will present Psychotic Disorders, Current Concepts and Therapeutics. This webinar will take place on Tuesday, February 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you for joining us and enjoy the rest of the day. Take care.